He's a billionaire. His son, diagnosed with severe autism, never spoke, never smiled, and never laughed, not once. Every expert failed. Every method led to silence. Until one day, a new maid was hired. No experience, no titles, just heart. And then, in the kitchen, she did something so simple yet so powerful that for the first time in his life, the boy burst into laughter and everything changed. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Richard Wakefield was a billionaire who made his fortune in agribusiness. After his wife passed away, he stopped spending time on anything else and chose to live in complete isolation with his only son, Leo. They lived in a huge and expensive mansion filled with everything money could buy, but the place always felt cold and empty. There were no sounds of joy, no conversations, and no signs of family life. Even with all the luxury, the house didn't feel like a home. Richard tried to distract himself with work for a while, but after his wife's death, he couldn't focus anymore. His world had become silent and lonely. Leo, his young son, had been diagnosed with autism and didn't speak, didn't laugh, and never showed signs of connection. Richard didn't know how to reach him. He spent his days walking through the quiet halls of the mansion, trying to understand what had gone wrong. Every room reminded him of what he had lost and how alone he and his son had become. Despite not knowing how to help Leo, Richard refused to give up. He hired several professionals over the years, all experts in child development, hoping someone could connect with his son. Most of them left after a few months, saying Leo showed no reaction to their techniques. Then came Dr. Adrian Keller, a well-known therapist with many impressive qualifications. He had helped several high-profile families, and his reputation was strong. Richard thought maybe this was the breakthrough they needed. Dr. Keller spoke confidently, explained the challenges of Leo's condition, and told Richard that progress would be slow. He said there was no magic solution and that Leo's development would depend on long, continuous therapy sessions. Richard listened carefully to every word, desperate for hope. Dr. Keller became a regular visitor at the mansion, and Richard trusted his opinion more than anyone else's. He followed all of his advice, never questioning anything. He thought he was doing the right thing for Leo. Each session with Dr. Keller followed a similar routine. He would enter the playroom where Leo waited quietly, surrounded by soft toys and educational tools. Keller would speak in calm tones, trying to trigger any form of reaction, but Leo usually just sat still, staring at nothing. Sometimes he made small movements or looked at an object briefly, but never made eye contact. Richard watched some of the sessions through the security cameras, always hoping to see something different. Keller always left with the same comments, that things were progressing slowly, but there were small signs of improvement. Richard clung to these words. He felt powerless and guilty, always wondering if he had missed something as a father. Maybe he hadn't been there enough before his wife passed. Maybe Leo had been this way for longer than he realized. He stayed quiet about these thoughts, burying them deep inside, and instead focused on paying for more sessions, more specialists, and anything that might give his son a chance. As the months went by, the mansion remained quiet. The only sounds were the footsteps of the few staff members who still worked there, and the occasional voice of Dr. Keller during therapy. Richard barely left the estate. He stopped attending business meetings and let his company run without his presence. Every part of his attention was directed toward Leo. But while Richard believed Keller was doing everything possible to help his son, the truth was different. Keller often stretched the length of sessions without real purpose. He repeated exercises that had no effect and took detailed notes filled with complex language that didn't reflect any real progress. He always made it seem like the work was important, that something would eventually change. In reality, he knew Leo wasn't responding to his methods, and he didn't mind. As long as Richard kept paying him, Keller was content. He saw the Wakefield family as a long-term opportunity, a job that wouldn't end soon. Keller's true motivation wasn't helping Leo. It was maintaining the illusion of progress to keep the sessions going as long as possible. He never said anything directly dishonest, but carefully used vague language and hopeful phrases. Richard, dealing with grief and guilt, didn't question much. He just wanted someone to guide him, to make him believe there was still a chance for his son. Keller was skilled at appearing professional and kind. He knew exactly what to say to keep Richard's trust. Sometimes he would bring new tools or change the layout of the therapy room to seem innovative. But Leo remained the same. He sat in silence, disconnected from the world around him, trapped in his own mind. Keller never made a real effort to understand Leo on a deeper level. His focus was on making Richard feel like things were under control. And so, week after week, he returned to the mansion, billed more hours, and continued the cycle without any real results. Inside the luxurious but lifeless mansion, the truth was hard to see. Richard walked through the same silent hallways every day, passing rooms filled with untouched furniture and memories of a happier time. He sat by the fireplace at night, sometimes holding a photo of his wife, wondering if she would have done things differently. Leo remained quiet, rarely showing any emotion. The house had become a place where time stood still. Richard believed he was doing all he could, trusting experts, spending money, and staying close to his son. But he didn't realize that Keller had no real plan for Leo. His only plan was to stay involved for as long as possible, keeping Richard hopeful and unaware. The silence in the mansion wasn't just about Leo's condition, it was the result of grief, manipulation, and a father's desperation. Still, every morning Richard woke up with the same hope that something would change. He had no idea the person he trusted most was the one holding them back. Julia Bennett arrived at the Wakefield mansion on a quiet Tuesday morning. She had been hired as a housemaid to help with the basic tasks around the large estate. The place was beautiful but felt strangely lifeless. The walls were clean, the furniture expensive, and everything was in perfect order, yet there was no feeling of warmth anywhere. Julia noticed that right away. The staff she met were polite but distant. Everyone spoke in low voices and avoided making noise. She was told early on to be careful not to disturb Leo, the boy of the house. Most new employees were nervous about working there because of the silence and the strange atmosphere, but Julia wasn't. She had worked in other quiet homes before and didn't expect this one to be any different. She moved through the mansion with calm steps, carefully doing her duties and observing the environment. It didn't take long for her to feel that something was different about this place, something deeper than just silence. Julia saw Leo for the first time on her second day. He was sitting on the floor of a large room, surrounded by toys that looked brand new. None of them had been touched. He stared at the floor and didn't react when she entered. Julia didn't try to talk to him. She didn't get close or force interaction. She simply cleaned around him slowly and calmly, letting him see that she was there. She could sense that Leo wasn't just dealing with autism. There was a heavy sadness in his expression, a deep loneliness that seemed to fill the room. Julia didn't know much about autism, but she knew how to observe people. She had seen many types of pain in her life, and this boy wasn't just unresponsive. He seemed disconnected from everyone. So instead of treating him like a problem to be solved, she chose to stay near without asking anything in return. Her presence was soft and steady, and day by day, she kept showing up the same way. Richard quickly noticed that Julia was different from the other employees. She didn't rush, didn't complain, and didn't act afraid of being around Leo. He would sometimes see her walking by his office or sitting quietly in the garden, just folding laundry or cleaning small things. There was a calmness about her that made the mansion feel less tense. For the first time in months, Richard felt something change. It wasn't dramatic or loud, but it was enough to give him a bit of comfort. He didn't speak much with Julia at first, but he kept noticing how Leo seemed a little more relaxed when she was around. He wasn't smiling or talking, but he didn't turn away or get upset when she entered the room. That small difference meant a lot to Richard. He began to think that maybe her presence was helping in a way no one had before. Still, he wasn't sure what to do with this feeling, or if it even mattered in the big picture. Eventually, Dr. Adrian Keller learned that a new maid had been hired. During a casual conversation with Richard, Keller asked how things at home were going. Richard mentioned Julia and how she seemed to bring a softer atmosphere to the mansion. Keller raised an eyebrow and asked more questions. When he realized Julia had been spending time around Leo, he gave a carefully worded warning. He said that people without clinical training could unintentionally interfere with therapy. He told Richard that he needed to be cautious, that emotional responses shouldn't replace professional care. Keller didn't sound angry, but his message was clear. Julia was not part of the plan, and her influence could be a problem. Richard, unsure of what to believe, nodded but didn't make any changes. He didn't want to dismiss the possibility that Julia's calm presence was helping, even if Keller disagreed. He told himself it wasn't a big deal, that Julia was just a housemaid doing her job, nothing more. But to Keller, Julia was more than a maid. She was a variable he couldn't control. He had built his method carefully, with each session planned and each report tailored to keep Richard trusting the process. Julia's presence wasn't in his schedule, and he couldn't predict how she might affect Leo. More importantly, Keller felt something he hadn't expected, a sense of threat. Not because Julia was doing anything wrong, but because she was doing something right. Without any training, without medical tools or theories, she was connecting with Leo in a way Keller had never managed to do. And that made him uncomfortable. If Richard started to believe in Julia's influence, maybe he would start questioning the therapy. Keller didn't show these thoughts, of course. On the surface, he remained calm and professional. But inside, he began to monitor Julia more closely. Every time he visited the mansion, he paid more attention to where she was, what she was doing, and how Leo responded when she was nearby. Julia had no idea about Keller's thoughts. For her, this was just a job. She cleaned, folded clothes, prepared small tasks, and sometimes spent time in the same room as Leo. She didn't talk much, didn't try to teach him anything, and didn't see herself as a special person. She just noticed that the boy seemed less tense when she was around, so she continued being nearby without pressure. Her actions were small but steady. She would sit quietly on the floor, while Leo played with a single object or just looked out the window. Sometimes she would hum softly while folding towels, not for him, but simply to make the space feel less empty. She didn't expect results. She wasn't trying to fix him. But in a house filled with routines, therapy sessions, and silence, her simple presence was different. It was real. Without knowing it, Julia had started something new, and while she didn't see herself as important, both Richard and Keller were beginning to feel the weight of her quiet impact. Julia was cleaning the hallway near the playroom, following her usual routine. She held a few cleaning cloths in her hand while dusting a small table. As she stepped back to move around the corner, one of the cloths slipped from her hand and fell to the floor. It made a light sound as it landed, nothing dramatic or loud. Julia bent down to pick it up quickly. That's when she noticed something different. Leo, who was sitting nearby on a soft rug with his back against the wall, looked in her direction and smiled. Just a little. It wasn't big or long, but it was clear. A small curve of his lips. Then his face went back to its usual stillness. But for Julia, It was enough. That brief moment stayed in her mind. She didn't say anything out loud. She didn't even change her expression. But inside, she felt something warm. She didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so she simply kept cleaning and quietly held that memory for herself. Later that day, Julia walked past Leo again and couldn't stop thinking about the smile. She wasn't imagining it. She had seen it. For the rest of the afternoon, she watched from a distance, just doing her work as usual. Leo didn't smile again, but his eyes seemed more aware of her movements. He wasn't staring, but he wasn't ignoring her either. Julia didn't try to repeat the situation. She believed in doing things naturally. She didn't want to push or force anything. She kept working as she always did, calmly, slowly, and without trying to interact. But in her heart, she felt more confident. She believed something important had happened, a tiny step, but a real one. She thought maybe Leo was starting to feel safe around her. Maybe he didn't see her as a stranger anymore. She wanted to give him time, so she decided to be patient and continue being present in her quiet way. To her, that smile was not just a reflex. It meant something more. Richard had not seen the smile. He spent most of the day in his office, busy with phone calls and paperwork. When Julia passed by his door to bring some clean towels, she thought about telling him, but decided not to. She didn't want to give him hope over something small. She also worried that maybe he would ask too many questions and turn it into something official. Julia didn't want that. She preferred to let things happen naturally. Over the next few days, she continued her quiet routine, staying close to Leo when possible, but never pushing for attention. Sometimes she would sweep near the rug where he sat. Sometimes she just folded clothes in the same room. And although Leo didn't smile again, he also didn't avoid her. He stayed in place, calm and quiet. That was enough for Julia. She had seen his first real reaction, and it gave her strength to keep going. She believed she was slowly building something with him, something honest and delicate. Eventually, Julia shared the moment with someone. She told the story during a short conversation with one of the older maids who had worked in the mansion for years. The maid listened kindly, but didn't say much. Later that week, the comment reached Richard. Curious, he asked Julia about it while passing her in the hallway. Did Leo really smile? He asked, almost in a whisper. Julia paused, then nodded softly. It was very small and very fast. But yes, I think so. Richard didn't know how to react. He wanted to feel happy, but he was also afraid to expect too much. So he mentioned it during his next conversation with Dr. Keller, thinking maybe the therapist would be pleased. But Keller didn't smile or show any excitement. He crossed his arms and spoke with his usual calm tone. That's not progress, he said. Children like Leo often show random movements. A smile can be a reflex. Don't confuse it with real improvement. His words were sharp, but polite. Still, they made Richard hesitate. Keller's reaction bothered Julia when she heard about it. She couldn't understand why he would speak that way. She knew she didn't have training or experience like him, but she also knew what she had seen. It wasn't random. She had spent weeks near Leo, watching him carefully. She had learned his patterns, his moods, and his stillness. That smile was different. It was brief, yes, but it came at the right moment. Not during therapy, not during any forced exercise, just during a simple moment between two people in the same space. Julia began to see the contrast more clearly. Keller's approach was technical, strict, and structured. He didn't look at Leo like a child. He saw him as a patient, a list of symptoms. Julia didn't want to take his place or interfere, but she felt she was connecting with Leo in a way that Keller never had. She felt Leo's silence wasn't just about his condition. It was also about not feeling understood. Julia wanted to understand him, with no agenda. Even though Keller kept denying the importance of the smile, Julia held on to it. She didn't need approval from anyone to know what she felt. From that day forward, she became even more careful with her presence around Leo. She didn't push, didn't try to repeat the moment. Instead, she kept offering quiet companionship, folding laundry, cleaning in silence, or just sitting nearby if the room felt too empty. Every time she walked into a room and Leo didn't turn away, it felt like a small success. And when Richard asked for updates, she gave simple answers. Nothing exaggerated, just facts. Keller continued his sessions as always, never adjusting his method, never mentioning the smile again. But Julia remembered it clearly. It became her quiet proof that something was changing. It wasn't big or fast, but it was real. During the cleaning, Julia had dropped a cloth. Leo had smiled, quickly, softly, but truly. She never forgot that. For her, it was the first sign that she had reached his heart. One afternoon, while tidying the floor in the playroom, Julia noticed something strange. Leo was sitting in his usual spot, lining up a group of colored blocks in a straight line. He did it slowly, placing one block at a time with great focus. Julia had seen him do this before, but this time she decided to do something different. She grabbed another set of blocks and began copying his actions, placing them in a line beside his, not touching or interrupting his pattern. She stayed quiet, just matching his movements at her own pace. After a few minutes, she noticed Leo glance at her. It wasn't a long stare, but it was more than usual. Then, after a short pause, he picked another block and continued. Julia did the same. For several minutes, they lined up blocks together, side by side, in silence. This moment, although small, felt meaningful to Julia. She realized she had found a way to gently enter Leo's world, not by forcing him to change, but by respecting what he already did. Julia began using this approach more often. She didn't call it a strategy or therapy. To her, it was simply following Leo's rhythm. When she noticed him spinning a toy car, she would spin another toy car nearby. If he tapped his fingers on a surface, she would gently tap the same way. It was never loud or exaggerated. She made sure not to overwhelm him. Sometimes he would stop and look at her, not with fear, but with interest. These small reactions gave Julia encouragement. Over time, the boy's eyes began to follow her movements more frequently. He never spoke or smiled much, but something was changing in his attention. Richard, who often passed by the room without entering, started noticing the difference too. He would stand quietly by the door and watch Julia and Leo moving in sync. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt a small sense of hope. He didn't say anything to Julia at first, but he started believing that what she was doing might matter. One morning, Richard finally stepped into the room while Julia and Leo were playing with wooden shapes. He didn't want to interrupt, so he stayed off to the side. He watched as Julia patiently followed Leo's actions, always a step behind, always respectful. Leo didn't push her away or move to another corner like he used to when others got close. He stayed right there. Richard was surprised by how peaceful the scene was. After the session ended, he asked Julia gently how she came up with that method. Julia simply replied, "I just do what he does. It makes him feel like he's not alone." Richard nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. He hadn't seen any doctor or therapist do this before. Julia's actions didn't come from a textbook or manual. They came from observation, patience, and time. Richard felt something shift inside him. Maybe there was more to caring for Leo than just following expert advice. Maybe connection didn't always require professional techniques. When Dr. Keller visited the mansion later that week, Richard brought up Julia's interactions with Leo. He described how Julia had been gently imitating Leo's routines, and how Leo seemed to be more aware of her presence. Instead of showing interest, Keller frowned slightly and interrupted. "That's not helpful," he said. "Allowing a maid to mimic behavior like that only reinforces repetitive patterns. It's counterproductive." Keller's voice was calm but firm. He reminded Richard that Leo's development required structured therapy and expert supervision. These untrained actions might feel good emotionally, but they don't bring clinical results, Keller added. Richard didn't argue, but he felt uncomfortable. He didn't like how Keller referred to Julia, as if she were doing something wrong by being kind. Richard had seen the interaction himself. He had felt it, and yet now he was being told it was wrong. He didn't know what to think. Part of him trusted Keller's experience, but another part, a growing one, believed in what he had seen with his own eyes. Julia noticed that Keller became colder toward her after that. He no longer greeted her or acknowledged her presence when walking through the halls. Still, she wasn't bothered. She continued doing what she believed was right. Every day, she spent time with Leo in small, meaningful ways. She repeated his movements, never forcing him to change, just showing that she was willing to meet him where he was. Sometimes they would sit side by side in silence for long stretches. Other times he would watch her out of the corner of his eye as she copied him. Even without words, Julia felt they were building something together. She wasn't trying to cure him. She was just trying to show him he wasn't alone. Over time, she noticed tiny changes. A longer look, a softer posture, a brief pause before he moved a toy. These things weren't miracles, but they were real. She didn't need anyone's approval to see that. And no matter how Keller felt, Julia kept showing up every day with the same calm patience. Keller, however, began to feel uneasy. Something about the situation was slipping out of his control. Richard, who used to hang on to every word he said, now seemed quieter during their conversations. He no longer asked as many questions or followed every piece of advice blindly. Keller noticed the change, and it frustrated him. He didn't like feeling replaced, even in a small way. Julia was a housemaid, not a therapist, and yet she was getting results, or at least changes, that he couldn't claim as his own. He didn't say anything directly to her, but inside he began to worry. What if Richard stopped the therapy sessions? What if he began to believe that kindness was more effective than his methods? Keller didn't want to lose his position or his influence. And more than that, he didn't want to admit that someone without training might be doing something valuable. While Julia moved closer and closer to Leo through trust and patience, Keller started realizing he was no longer the only person guiding Leo's path. It was a normal afternoon in the kitchen. Julia was cleaning the counters, while Leo sat quietly at the table with his usual calm expression. There was a bucket of soapy water nearby, filled with foam from the dishes she had just finished. Julia was in a playful mood. Wanting to make the cleaning feel lighter, she picked up the bucket, checked that it was light enough, and gently placed it on her head like a hat. Foam spilled a little down the sides, and some water dripped on her shirt. She turned to Leo with a funny face and said, "Look at my new hat!" For a second, Leo just stared. Then something completely unexpected happened. His face lit up, and he started laughing. It wasn't just a small smile or a soft giggle. He burst out laughing, loudly, from deep inside. Julia froze in surprise. She didn't expect that reaction, but her heart filled with joy. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it was real. Leo didn't stop at just laughing. After a few seconds, he stood up and walked toward the counter where Julia had been working. He looked at the bucket on her head, then looked at the sink. Without any help, he climbed carefully onto the counter and reached for another empty bucket that was sitting nearby. Julia watched closely, unsure of what he would do. To everyone's surprise, Leo put the bucket on his own head, just like Julia had done. Water and soap spilled down the sides, covering his face and shoulders, but he didn't seem to care. Instead, he started laughing again, even louder this time. His laugh echoed through the kitchen. It was a sound that no one in the house had ever heard before. Julia laughed with him, wiping water from his face gently. At that moment, Richard entered the kitchen and saw the scene. He froze. Leo was laughing, soaked with water, a bucket on his head, smiling like a different child. Richard's eyes filled with tears. Richard couldn't believe what he was seeing. His son, who had spent years in silence and isolation, was now laughing with joy, soaked in soapy water with Julia. It didn't look like therapy. It didn't look like anything scientific, but it was real. Richard stood by the door, covering his mouth with his hand, overcome with emotion. Tears rolled down his face as he watched Leo laugh freely. He hadn't cried in a long time, not like this, not from happiness. Julia looked up and saw Richard. She gave him a small nod, not saying anything. She knew this moment was big, and she didn't want to ruin it by talking too much. Leo kept playing with the bucket, tipping it slightly and letting water drip on the floor while giggling. The floor was wet, the kitchen was a mess, but no one cared. What mattered was that something had broken through. Leo had laughed. He had copied Julia. He had responded in a way no one expected. That single moment changed everything. Later that evening, Richard couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He felt like the house had come alive for the first time in years. He wanted to share the story. So when Keller came for his scheduled session, Richard brought it up. He described everything: the foam, the bucket, the laughter, even how Leo had copied Julia. He smiled as he told the story, still amazed. Keller listened without showing much emotion. When Richard finished, expecting some kind of celebration or acknowledgement, Keller gave a small smirk and said, "That's dangerous and irresponsible. You're letting him associate nonsense behavior with fun." Richard's smile faded a little. Keller continued, "You don't want to reward chaotic or silly actions. It can delay real progress. This type of thing has no therapeutic value." His words hit hard. Richard looked down, confused. He had felt something powerful in that moment, something pure, but now he was being told it was wrong. Still, deep inside, Richard wasn't sure he believed Keller anymore. Julia overheard parts of the conversation while passing by the hallway. She didn't stop to listen, but she could tell from Richard's face when he came out of the room that something had changed. She didn't expect praise, and she certainly didn't expect Keller to support what had happened. But she knew in her heart that what she had seen and what she had heard mattered more than any rule or theory. That laugh was real. It came from inside Leo, and it wasn't a trick or a forced response. It came from connection, from trust, from sharing a simple, silly moment. Julia wasn't trained, but she understood people. She had worked with many families before, and she had seen when a child felt seen for the first time. That's what had happened. Leo had let himself feel joy, even if just for a few seconds, because he felt safe with her. And no matter what anyone said, Julia knew that was worth everything. No doctor could take that truth from her. Keller didn't talk about the laugh again. He avoided the subject during the next visits. But something inside him had shifted. He felt angry, not just at Julia, but at the entire situation. He had spent months with Leo and had never seen a reaction like that. And now a maid, with no degree or title, had managed to do what he couldn't. He told himself it was a fluke, an accident. But the more he thought about it, the more it bothered him. Meanwhile, Richard became quieter during their sessions. He followed instructions less and began asking more questions. Julia didn't brag about the moment. She just went on with her work, calm and focused. But Keller could feel that his control over the situation was slipping. For the first time, he felt threatened, not by words, but by something much stronger. Results. The kind that couldn't be measured in charts or reports. In the kitchen that day, Julia had placed a bucket on her head. Leo had laughed for the first time in his life. Richard was walking through the hallway, going toward his study, when something unexpected happened. He had just passed the staircase when he heard fast footsteps behind him. Before he could turn around fully, he felt small arms wrap around his waist. It took him a moment to realize what was happening. Leo was hugging him. Not a light touch, not guided by anyone, but a real hug. Spontaneous. Leo had never done that before. For years, Richard had longed for something like this. A simple moment of physical closeness, something that didn't feel forced or part of therapy. He stood there, shocked, arms still at his sides, afraid that moving too quickly might ruin the moment. Slowly, he lowered his hands and hugged his son back gently. Leo stayed there for a few seconds, then stepped away and looked up at his father without any fear. Richard's eyes filled with tears. His heart was beating fast. He didn't understand what had changed, but in that moment, he didn't care. His son had reached out to him. Julia was nearby and had seen it all. She smiled warmly, but didn't say anything until Richard looked at her in complete disbelief. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Yes," Julia replied calmly. "He came to you on his own." Richard could barely speak. He had no words to describe how that moment felt. "What did you do?" he asked, not accusingly, but truly wanting to understand. Julia explained that earlier that day, she and Leo had been playing with some cushions in the living room. They had created a small game where Leo would throw a pillow at her, and she would pretend to fall. It made him laugh. After a while, he started bringing the pillow to her and putting it in her arms, then gently leaning against her. Julia had just gone along with it. She didn't plan anything. "It was just play. I think he's starting to feel safe," she said. "Maybe now he's learning how to show affection in his own way." For so long, he had been told that Leo's progress would be slow, clinical and technical, that every change would need to come from structured sessions, behavior plans, and hours of analysis. But now, his son had shown a real sign of love, and it came during a simple game. No one had guided Leo. He wasn't being tested or watched by a specialist. He had acted on his own, and it had happened with Julia, not during any therapy session. Richard realized how much Julia had done by simply being patient, present, and kind. He thought about all the months of silence, all the failed therapies, all the professionals who had told him to be realistic. And yet, now, he had just felt his son's arms around him. It wasn't just about Leo. It was also about Richard feeling like a father again. Something inside him shifted. For the first time in years, he felt truly hopeful. And that hope didn't come from science. It came from connection. When Keller arrived for his next scheduled visit, Richard mentioned the hug. He described the event exactly as it had happened, trying to keep his tone neutral, but his face still showed emotion. Keller listened with a tight expression. He nodded slowly, then said, "I understand why that feels meaningful, but you need to be careful." Richard frowned. Keller continued, "Sometimes when children on the spectrum are overstimulated or confused by new dynamics, they can display unusual behavior. It doesn't always mean progress." Richard felt uncomfortable. Keller leaned in slightly and added, "The real issue is Julia. She's not trained. She doesn't understand the risks. Too much emotional interference can cause setbacks." Richard didn't respond right away. He was trying to stay calm. Then Keller went further. "You might want to consider limiting her involvement. She may mean well, but this type of behavior could lead to regression. You don't want to undo all the professional work we've done." Richard felt the pressure in Keller's tone. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a warning. Richard didn't know how to respond. He felt caught in the middle. Keller had been with the family for a long time. He was trusted, experienced, and had impressive credentials. But the hug, that moment with Leo, had come from Julia's presence, not from anything in Keller's plan. Richard tried to explain that the hug hadn't caused any distress. In fact, Leo had been calmer than usual all afternoon. But Keller insisted. Then, with a colder tone, he added something that made Richard pause. "I think you should also ask yourself why Julia is so invested in your son. She may enjoy the attention. People with no background often get involved for the wrong reasons." Richard stared at him. Keller continued, "You have to be careful. Not everyone around you has good intentions." For the first time, Richard felt more disturbed than convinced. He didn't like the way Keller was speaking. Not about Leo, not about Julia, and especially not about something as meaningful as a simple hug between father and son. That night, Richard sat alone in his study, thinking. He replayed the moment when Leo hugged him over and over in his mind. It wasn't just an emotional reaction. It was real. It had happened and no one could convince him otherwise. Keller's words had sounded more like jealousy than concern. Richard remembered how Julia had never once asked for praise. She never tried to stand out. She never asked to be included in decisions or meetings. She just showed up every day and gave her best to Leo without expecting anything. And that had made the difference. Slowly, Richard's trust in Keller started to weaken. Not because of one sentence, but because of a pattern he was starting to see. Keller always dismissed Julia's influence no matter what. He always made sure he was the only expert in control. But now, Richard was beginning to think for himself. He had felt something that no one could take away, his son's arms around him, warm and real. That was the moment he started to doubt Keller. Leo's days were no longer silent. Now the boy laughed freely, played with toys, and even said simple words like ball, more, and water. His voice was soft and sometimes unclear, but each word was real, and each sound filled the house with something it hadn't had in years: life. Julia continued to play with him every day. She used foam from the kitchen sink to make silly shapes. She brought colorful objects and arranged them in fun ways. She also sang songs, not complex ones, just short melodies with repeating words that Leo began to copy. Sometimes he clapped along, sometimes he hummed parts of the tune. Richard now joined in too. He would sit on the floor, roll a ball to Leo, or hold up pictures while naming them slowly. These small moments became a new kind of routine. The cold mansion that once felt like a museum now echoed with laughter, music, and the sounds of a father finally getting to know his son. Everything was changing, and quickly. Richard began spending more time with Leo, not out of duty, but because he truly enjoyed it. They would build small towers with blocks, throw soft pillows at each other, or watch cartoons together. Leo often sat close to Richard now, sometimes resting his head on his father's arm. The man who had once been afraid of losing his son to silence was now watching him grow in real time. Julia made the process feel natural. She never rushed Leo, never pushed him too hard. She encouraged him gently, always adjusting her approach to how he was feeling that day. Some days, Leo was more open. Other days, he was quieter, but he was never forced to perform. His progress was coming from freedom, not pressure. Richard couldn't believe how much had changed in such a short time. He felt connected to his son, something he had once feared might never happen. And most importantly, he felt hope. Not the hope someone sells in a report, but the kind you feel with your own eyes and heart. But not everyone felt the same. Dr. Keller watched all of this unfold with growing anger. The more progress Leo showed, the less control Keller seemed to have. He couldn't deny that the boy was improving. Anyone could see it. But it wasn't happening inside the therapy room. It wasn't coming from his reports or his sessions. It was coming from games, music, colors, and emotional connection, things he had always considered distractions. Keller began pushing back. He told Richard that Leo's behavior was unstable and that only clinical structure could guide real development. He started suggesting more sessions. Twice a day, he said, at least 3 times a week. Each session came with a high price, but Keller didn't seem to care. He called the spontaneous improvements emotional illusions, and said they were unpredictable and would not last. Richard hesitated. He didn't want to upset Keller, but he also couldn't ignore the results. Leo was smiling, playing and saying words, and none of that had come from therapy scripts or tests. Keller's frustration grew deeper. He began watching Julia more closely during his visits. She didn't confront him or speak against him, but her presence irritated him. She didn't follow his suggestions, and yet she got results. She didn't use professional terms, but she understood Leo in a way he never had. Keller decided he needed to take action. One afternoon, when Julia was alone in the kitchen preparing lunch, Keller entered and closed the door behind him. He didn't shout. His tone was low and cold. He looked her in the eyes and said, "You don't understand what you're doing. You're interfering with a process you know nothing about. If you keep going, I can make sure you lose this job." Julia stood still. She didn't respond. She didn't argue. But something changed inside her at that moment. For the first time, she clearly saw Keller's true face. He wasn't just a man of routine. He was trying to stop something good. He was protecting his control, not Leo's progress. Julia didn't tell Richard what had happened right away. She wanted to be sure of how she felt. Over the next few days, she watched Keller with sharper eyes. She noticed how he only spoke with authority, never warmth. He always referred to Leo in technical terms, never as a child, but as a subject in a process. He never laughed, never celebrated the boy's small victories, and never asked how Leo felt. Everything he did was about measurement, reports, and keeping his role. Julia, meanwhile, kept doing what had always worked: kindness, patience, play. Every day, Leo grew more confident. He said new words. He responded faster to questions. He even began pointing at things he wanted, something he had never done before. And through it all, Julia became more certain. The real enemy was no longer silence or autism or uncertainty. The real threat to Leo's growth was a man who saw change as a problem if it didn't come from him. She now knew Keller wasn't helping. He was holding Leo back. Richard started sensing the tension. He saw the difference between Keller's stiff approach and Julia's honest care. He watched how Leo smiled whenever Julia entered the room, how his posture relaxed, how his eyes followed her. With Keller, Leo returned to stillness. Richard remembered the hug, the laughter, the words, and now the games. All of it had happened because someone had taken the time to understand Leo, not from books, but from being there. So when Keller demanded another series of expensive sessions, Richard paused. He no longer said yes immediately. He started asking more questions. Keller didn't like that. And when Richard finally learned about the warning Keller gave Julia, something inside him changed completely. He was done being manipulated. He realized he had trusted the wrong person for too long. As Leo played nearby, stacking colored cups and humming a tune, Richard made a quiet decision. The future of his son would no longer be built on fear, pressure, or control. From now on, it would be built on trust, and Leo's world would stay open. Leo's transformation became more visible each day. He started to do things that no one had expected from him just months ago. He began gently touching people's faces, especially Julia's and Richard's. Sometimes he would place his small hands on their cheeks, looking at them with curiosity. These touches were light and full of intention. He also began asking for things, not with full sentences, but with clear words like ball, juice, or again. He made eye contact more often and laughed at simple things, like the noise of a spoon falling or the sound of someone sneezing. These reactions were new and full of life. The house, which had once been silent and cold, now felt warm. The change spread to everyone. Staff members who used to work quietly now smiled more. They played along when Leo ran around or made funny noises. The energy in the mansion was different. Joy had returned, not because of therapy sessions, but because Leo was discovering the world and inviting others to discover it with him. Julia continued playing a big part in Leo's progress. She didn't do anything complex. Her methods were simple, using toys, songs, facial expressions, or short games, but the results were clear. Leo responded to her. He trusted her. Julia could tell when he was happy, tired, or ready to play. She adjusted herself to his pace, never forcing him. Richard saw everything. He began to spend even more time at home, often joining their little games. Watching his son grow and interact was more valuable than anything else in his life. The staff, once unsure about how to behave around Leo, now welcomed him into their routines. The cook let him smell ingredients. The gardener gave him small tools to hold. Even the housekeeper showed him how to fold napkins, turning it into a game. The mansion, once so formal and serious, had become more like a home. It was filled with laughter, footsteps, and voices. Leo had brought the house back to life, and Julia was the one who helped him do it. But not everyone welcomed the change. Dr. Keller was growing more upset by the day. He noticed that Leo's progress was happening outside of his sessions. Keller hadn't been part of the new developments, and that made him feel excluded. He had spent months guiding the family, and now he felt like he was losing control. He became more aggressive in his attitude, especially toward Richard. During one of their meetings, Keller spoke directly. "Julia may mean well, but she's not trained. She could be doing more harm than good." Richard listened but didn't agree. He had seen the results with his own eyes. Leo was better, happier, more responsive, and more connected. Richard reminded Keller of all the things Leo had done recently. Keller didn't respond kindly. He said those changes might be random or short-lived. Then he went further. "You need someone qualified," he said. "A real professional, not a housemaid pretending to know therapy." His words were sharp. Richard stayed calm, but inside he felt something shift. He didn't like where this was going. When Richard didn't follow Keller's suggestion, Keller changed tactics. He stopped trying to convince Richard directly and started spreading quiet comments around the mansion. He spoke to the other staff in passing, dropping subtle suggestions. "Julia has been exaggerating things," he told one maid casually. "She's been telling Richard what he wants to hear." To the cook, he said, "Be careful. Not everything she says about Leo is true." These comments weren't loud or obvious, but they worked like poison. Soon, Julia noticed strange looks. Some employees who used to chat with her now avoided eye contact. Others kept conversations short. She couldn't prove anything, but she could feel the change. Rumors were spreading, and she had no way to stop them. It hurt her deeply, especially because all she had done was care. Still, she didn't argue or defend herself. Her focus remained on Leo. He was the reason she was there. And no matter how others behaved, she wasn't going to let gossip or fear interfere with his progress. Julia started feeling isolated in the very house she had helped transform. Her mornings became quieter. Some staff avoided her in the kitchen. Others walked away when she entered a room. She noticed it all, but chose not to react. Instead, she focused on Leo with even more care. She kept their games going, brought in new songs, and found small, creative ways to challenge him gently. When he spoke a new word or made a new sound, she celebrated it with the same energy, even if no one else seemed to care. Richard, however, noticed something was wrong. He saw how the staff had changed around Julia. He asked her directly one afternoon, and she finally shared the truth, not in anger, just honestly. She told him about the comments, the cold looks, and the way Keller had tried to turn people against her. Richard was furious. He didn't raise his voice, but his mind was made up. Julia had done nothing wrong. She had helped his son. That mattered more than anything else. Julia didn't ask for praise or protection. She just wanted Leo to be okay. But after everything that had happened, something became clear to her. For a long time, she thought the biggest challenge was helping Leo come out of his shell. But now she realized the real threat to his growth wasn't autism. It wasn't Leo's silence or his routines. The biggest danger was people like Keller, people who refused to see progress unless it came through their own methods, who felt threatened by change they didn't control, and who used fear to keep their power. Julia knew now that she had to protect Leo from more than just the outside world. She had to protect him from those who pretended to help but didn't really care. Even though she felt tired and hurt, her decision was strong. She wouldn't stop. Leo's world had opened up, and she would stand by him, no matter what Keller said, no matter how others treated her. She was here for Leo, and that wouldn't change. A few weeks later, Richard invited 2 new specialists to the mansion. They were not connected to Keller and came from respected clinics in another city. He wanted a fresh opinion, not based on old reports or biased views. When the specialists arrived, they observed Leo without interfering. They spent several days watching him in different situations, playing with Julia, eating with Richard, walking through the garden, and even listening to music. What they saw surprised them. Leo wasn't just making random sounds. He was speaking real words, laughing naturally, asking for objects, and showing awareness of people around him. After several days, they gave Richard their opinion. Leo was clearly developing. Not only that, but the way he reacted to Julia's presence and to his father's attention was strong evidence of emotional progress. They said the results were not forced or accidental. Leo was truly learning and changing. Julia was praised for her calm approach and creativity. One of the doctors even said, "Whatever she's doing, it's working, and it's working well." At first, she felt nervous. She had never worked in front of trained professionals like these, but their words were kind and respectful. They told her they had seen the way she connected with Leo and how her methods, even without formal training, had helped unlock something in the boy. They complimented her patience, her ability to read his moods, and the creative ways she had built trust. Julia didn't know what to say. She had never asked for attention or recognition. She only wanted Leo to be happy. Richard was sitting beside her and looked at her with tears in his eyes. He thanked her again and again. "You gave this family something I thought was lost," he said. "You gave us a new chance." Julia smiled quietly. It wasn't about being praised. It was about being seen. Everything she had gone through, the gossip, the judgment, the isolation, suddenly felt worth it. Leo was growing, and that was all that mattered. While the household felt lighter and more hopeful, Keller grew more and more desperate. He had seen his role shrink and his control disappear. Richard stopped scheduling extra sessions. The staff no longer paid much attention to his comments. And worst of all, the progress Leo had made was now being confirmed by new doctors, people who had no reason to lie. Keller couldn't accept it. His pride was deeply hurt. He had built his reputation over years, always seen as the expert, the one with answers. But now it was Julia, a simple housemaid who had succeeded where he had failed. His anger grew quietly, hidden behind forced smiles. Then, one morning, he decided to make a final move. He started spreading lies. He told a few staff members that Julia was manipulating Leo, teaching him to act a certain way just to make herself look good. "She's forcing reactions," he whispered. "It's all an act." These rumors spread quickly among a few employees who still listened to him. Richard found out about the rumors within days. A longtime employee who had grown close to Julia came to him privately and explained what Keller had been saying. At first, Richard didn't want to believe it, not because he trusted Keller, but because it was hard to imagine someone going that far. Still, he wanted to be sure, so he called the new specialists again and asked them clearly, "Is there any chance Leo's reactions are fake or forced?" The doctors looked surprised. "Absolutely not," one said. We've observed him independently. The joy, the words, the laughter, all of it is genuine. Children can't fake that level of connection, especially not over time. What we saw came from real trust and emotional safety. Richard felt both relieved and furious. Relieved because he knew the truth, but furious because someone had tried to destroy something so important. That night, he sat in his study for a long time, thinking about what Keller had done, not just recently, but from the very beginning. The next morning, Richard called Keller to his office. The conversation was short and quiet. Richard didn't yell. He simply asked direct questions. Keller tried to defend himself, using vague answers and acting like he was misunderstood, but Richard had already made up his mind. "You lied," he said, "not just about Julia, but about my son. You never believed in him. You believed in yourself, in keeping your place, your status. You cared more about being right than about helping." Keller's face changed. The calm mask he always wore cracked. He tried to recover, but it was too late. Richard told him clearly that his services were no longer needed. "We're choosing a different path now, one built on honesty." Keller left the mansion that same day. Some staff were surprised, others weren't. Julia didn't celebrate his exit. She just stayed close to Leo, as always, doing her job with quiet care. But deep inside, she felt a weight lift. The one person who had worked against Leo's progress was finally gone. After Keller's departure, things settled into a peaceful rhythm. The atmosphere in the mansion was warm. The staff smiled more, and people spoke openly again. Leo continued to grow. Every week, there was a new word, a new sound, a new game. Richard started planning small family trips, even if just to the park or a quiet cafe. Julia stayed by Leo's side through it all. She remained humble, never asking for more than what she already had, a place in Leo's world. Richard, now fully aware of everything that had happened, respected her deeply. He gave her more support, more freedom, and more trust. He even began working with the new specialists to create a healthy routine for Leo, one that kept play and emotional connection at its center. Looking back, Richard finally saw it clearly. Keller had never believed in Leo. Keller had only believed in control, in reputation, in being right. But Leo didn't need that. He just needed someone to believe in him, and thanks to Julia, now he had that, fully and forever. Months had passed, and Leo was a completely different boy. He was now attending a small school nearby, one that welcomed children with different learning needs. Julia went with him every morning, and Richard often joined when he could. Leo participated in classroom activities, listened to songs with the other children, and even joined in small performances where the kids danced or acted out simple scenes. He wasn't the loudest or the fastest, but he was present. He smiled, clapped, and sometimes even sang short phrases during the shows. The teachers were surprised at how quickly he adapted. They said he was curious, kind, and gentle with other students. Julia watched proudly from the back of the room, often holding back tears. Richard never missed a chance to record a video or take a photo. Back at home, Leo's laughter filled every hallway of the mansion. It wasn't rare to hear him giggling during bath time, during meals, or while playing hide and seek. The silence that once covered the house had truly disappeared. Inside the mansion, everything had changed. The staff who once tiptoed through the halls now joked with each other. Music played softly in the kitchen while Julia and Leo made simple snacks together. Richard started working from home more often, not because he had to, but because he wanted to be around. He would sit at his desk near the playroom, listening to Leo's voice while reviewing documents. In the evenings, they had family dinners, where Leo chose his favorite plate and sometimes helped set the table. Julia, once just a housemaid, now sat with them. She was no longer just an employee. She was treated like family. Richard included her in decisions about Leo's schedule and even about small things, like what games to buy or where to travel during holidays. The bond between the three of them was clear. What had started as a simple job for Julia had grown into something deeper. She had become a constant presence, a safe person, and a part of a family she helped rebuild. The memory of the kitchen moment, the day Julia put a soapy bucket on her head and made Leo laugh for the first time, was now seen as the beginning of everything. That silly, joyful moment had opened a door. Richard kept a photo of that day, taken just minutes after, where Leo had soap all over his shirt and was smiling at Julia. He kept it framed in his office. It reminded him of how far they had come. He sometimes looked at it during quiet moments, especially when doubts or fears came back. That photo was proof that small actions filled with love and respect could create real change. Whenever someone asked about Leo's progress, Richard told them about the bucket. He would say, "That's when our real journey started." People found it funny, but Richard meant every word. It hadn't been a medical breakthrough or a therapy trick. It had been connection, something no doctor had been able to create, but something Julia had sparked with patience and sincerity. As for Keller, he had disappeared from their lives completely. After being removed from Leo's case, word started to spread in the professional community. Other families began to come forward. Several parents shared their stories, similar patterns of guilt, fear, and manipulation. They spoke of long treatments with little progress and subtle pressure to depend completely on Keller's methods. Investigations began. Reports were written. His name, once respected, was now questioned everywhere. Clinics stopped working with him. Parents warned each other about his behavior in online groups. The truth was out. Keller hadn't believed in his patients. He had believed in control. He had built his success on making people feel helpless without him. Julia had been the first to break that cycle, even without realizing it. And Richard had helped expose the truth by trusting his own experience with his son instead of someone else's theory. The damage Keller had done couldn't be erased, but now at least it was known. He could no longer hide behind his title. One afternoon, while sitting on the back porch, Richard looked at Leo playing in the garden. Julia was sitting nearby, reading a book, keeping an eye on him. Leo was chasing butterflies, laughing loudly and calling out their colors. Richard felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The stress, the guilt, the pressure of doing everything right had faded. What remained was love, routine, and freedom. He thought about the early days, the silence, the fear, the confusion. Then he thought about now, the daily laughter, the gentle touches, the small words that meant so much. He realized something deep. Autism had never been the enemy. The real obstacle had been fear, and people like Keller who used that fear for control. Leo didn't need fixing. He needed understanding. He needed space, trust, and connection. Julia had given that to him. And through Leo's journey, Richard had learned how to be a father, not a perfect one, but a present one. That in itself was the most valuable lesson. Now the future didn't feel heavy anymore. There were still challenges ahead, and Richard knew that, but he no longer faced them with panic. He faced them with hope. Leo would continue to grow at his own pace, and whatever came next, they would handle it together. Julia would be there, Richard would be there, and Leo, with his bright eyes and new words, would lead the way. The mansion, once cold and silent, had become a place of joy, of growth, of family. Richard often thought about everything they had been through, the good and the bad, and came to one clear truth. The problem had never been Leo. The problem had been the people who couldn't see his potential. Keller had worn the mask of a professional, but he had never truly believed in the boy. Julia had no degrees, no titles, but she had believed from the start, and that made all the difference. Leo's laughter was now the soundtrack of their home, proof that love had won. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.